Welcome, future doctors, to another episode of the Future Minority Doctor podcast with Dr. Sulma
and Marina, where we bring you conversations to empower and inspire you to contribute to your community and the world by becoming a doctor. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Future Minority Doctor. I am so delighted today to have and to introduce a guest to you. It's Dr. Jacqueline Winkelmann. She is a pediatric hospitalist and also founder of a nonprofit organization called Scrub Sisters, which is a community and mentorship program for women in medicine at any stage. So from pre-medical students to medical students and residents, early career physicians to even retired physicians. It's a community to receive and to give support. So I'm so excited to have her on the podcast. She's going to be sharing her story of how she decided to go into medicine and all the adventures she's had along the way. So welcome, Dr. Jack.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It is an honor and my pleasure.
Excellent. So first off, I'd love to just kind of go back in time a little bit and just ask you, where are you from? What's your background?
I was born and raised in Puerto Rico. Parents and grandparents, and even some great-grandparents in Puerto Rico. They're Puerto Rican. I was not there for any other reason except that my family is Puerto Rican. And I grew up there. I moved to the States just when I started college.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. And what inspired you to become a doctor? When did that sort of seed begin to blossom within you of, you know what, I think medicine is for me?
Actually, pretty young and pretty specific. So one of my mom's uncles was one of the first pediatric surgeons in Puerto Rico. And from the time I was about 10 years old, he was my mentor, and I followed him around, and he was just very inspiring. I always saw how happy he was in life and how much his patients and his patients' parents adored him. And I just knew that there was something very special in taking care of children. So ever since I was a child, I wanted to be a pediatrician.
That's awesome. Yeah. So what was it like going through the whole road that it takes to become a physician for you? Starting in college, did you have much guidance? Did you have encouragement? Did you face any roadblocks along the way getting to medical school?
Yeah, well, I think because I was applying to college, undergrad, even before medical school, living in Puerto Rico, and this was in the pre-internet era, it was definitely tricky. I would say in my high school, my particular high school in Puerto Rico, I think we had about 100 students in my class. And of the 100 students, probably 75 went to college in the States. So it was very common. But there were definitely limitations to access of information from what the mainland offered as far as colleges and universities and what we knew of in Puerto Rico, right? This was back in the late 1980s. So that was definitely challenging because we only knew about the schools that recruited in Puerto Rico or the schools that came down. And of course, TV and things like that. And then we had that massive book of universities and colleges that I think they still exist in print. And that was pretty much it. So that was, I think, a hurdle, uncertainty of, what happens over there in the United States. And yeah, that was definitely a little tricky. I think we all assimilated perfectly fine. And all the schools that we went to, it seemed like there was a group of Puerto Ricans that were there. So it was fairly easy to assimilate. And I went to undergrad at WashU in St. Louis. So it wasn't, California or Florida or one of the states that have a lot of Latins. But at the same time, we had a little group there too. So that was comforting for sure. And I had some older students from my school that were friends that went there. So it made the transition a little easier.
Yeah. Gotcha. And what about your college days leading into medical school? Did you feel supported? Did you feel supported, especially as a Latina, as a woman, in your pursuit of medical school? Because I know, that sort of experience can be all over the place.
Yes, I have to say there were a couple of things. First, some surprises, right? Again, this was in the late 1980s. So I didn't realize what the perception of Puerto Ricans was in the United States,
Uh-huh.
especially in St. Louis, Missouri. And
Yeah.
interestingly, in that particular campus, there were a lot of students from the East Coast and especially from New York.
Uh-huh.
So it was very interesting to, move to the States. And then all of a sudden, people are asking me these questions about being Puerto Rican or living in Puerto Rico. And it was
Yeah.
quite surprising to me how little they knew
Mhm.
about Puerto Ricans in general, culture,
Yeah.
history, geography, even. So that was really surprising. Not as much an obstacle, I would say. It
Mhm.
was just shocking to me. But then later on in my training and my career, and this is going to sound really different, I think, from what you might hear from a lot of Latino doctors. But for
Uh-huh.
me, because of the way I look and because of my name, probably, I had a really hard time. I felt like I had to prove to everyone that I was indeed a Latina doctor. And I'll give you an
Interesting. Yeah.
example. My first day of medical school, and I ended up moving from St. Louis to Chicago for
Mhm.
medical school. I did 2 years of research in between because I got married young, and that was the
Mhm.
year I was engaged and the year I was married. Again, in those
Uh-huh.
days, taking gap years didn't exist.
Uh-huh.
And starting medical school, I started medical school on our 1 year anniversary. Also very
Uh-huh.
rare,
Yeah.
pretty common these days. But in any case, when I started, I remember I showed up to the first meeting of the Latin American Student Association, and I
Uh-huh.
walk in and I'm perfectly confident that I belong. And no, I got a lot of pushback. Not necessarily
Interesting.
pushback, just a lot of questioning, like, but wait, what was are your parents Puerto Rican? Why are they
Yeah.
there? Are they in the military? Are they in the pharmaceutical company? Over and over and
Uh-huh.
over again. So
Yeah.
what I expected was to get more questions and perhaps even microaggressions and even outright racist comments from non-Hispanics. I got
Uh-huh.
most questioned by Hispanics, which was
Yeah.
really hard
Interesting.
and honestly
Mhm.
still happens to this day.
Yeah. Oh, for sure.
But in those days when I was a student, I was applying to minority research fellowships and grants and I am 100% Puerto Rican, but
Uh-huh.
again, it was this. But wait, my best friend in medical school actually came with me to that particular meeting, and
Uh-huh.
her parents are Colombian. She's never been
Yeah.
to Colombia, but
Mhm.
her name is Claudia, and she has dark skin, dark eyes, dark hair,
Yeah.
and she had a Spanish last name.
Yeah.
So that was really interesting, and still continues to be. On the one hand, it still bothers me. And sometimes,
Yeah.
even being in the Latin American Medical Student Association
Mhm.
conversations, right?
Yeah.
And we hear a lot of, we need more Latina doctors or Latino doctors in general
Mhm.
because we need more doctors that look like their patients. And that always,
Mhm.
like, oh, it just makes me like, wait, I don't have to look like them to actually be them.
Mhm.
And on the other hand, though, it is so gratifying. And my most favorite part of medicine has been taking care of Hispanics. And
Mhm.
of course, after Chicago, which had quite a large Hispanic population, and
Uh-huh.
I worked specifically in some of those clinics, I moved to Southern California. So, of course, in Southern California, there's a million.
Of
And
course.
I have the privilege of taking care of those families. And they were assigned to me on the board at the hospital. And nothing makes me happier than to walk into a room and there's always this look on their faces like, oh no, another doctor I'm not going to be able to understand. But the minute
Yeah.
I open my mouth, they
Uh-huh.
know.
Yeah.
Here in California, they know two things. They know that I am a native speaker, not an
Uh-huh.
American doctor that speaks Spanish. And
Yeah.
two, they know I'm not Mexican because I'm in
Yeah.
Southern California. So
Right.
I have very much a Puerto Rican accent, but it's so satisfying. And I feel like the minute I open my mouth, there's an immediate connection that exists simply because they know I understand their
Mhm.
culture.
Yeah.
And I've been so grateful that I have practiced medicine in Chicago and California for the 20 plus years
Yeah.
that I worked in the clinical setting, and I was surrounded by that patient population. And then
Mhm.
the medical missions that I have worked on 4 or 5 from a group from our hospital, I've always waited
Yeah.
until they came around to this part of the world so that I could go to a Spanish speaking country, and same. It's just,
Uh-huh.
it's just a different relationship.
Yeah. You bring up a really interesting point because, it's true. We want not just the faces, but the experiences of
Mhm.
our physician workforce to reflect the faces and experiences of
Yep.
our patient population. And I think we can sometimes fall into the trap of making assumptions because of the way,
Yep.
we look. But really, I mean, there, like, the history of the world is a history of
Mhm.
mixing and colonization and all of that. And so you can't always assume by somebody's name
Yep.
or by someone's appearance anymore, like, where they're from or
Mhm.
what their experiences
Yep.
are. And that's
Yep.
wonderful that you've been able to serve serve the Latino population in the various places that you've been. And they immediately know, like you said, when you open your mouth, when you
Mhm.
speak, that this is a native
Yep.
Spanish speaker. That's fantastic.
Yes.
It also
Yeah.
brings up another point about what they call code switching. I'm curious to hear your
Mhm.
experience. I feel like identity is so complex, right? We all are an
Mhm.
intersection of different identities, right? And
Yes.
so we can't easily necessarily define identity for any particular person. But what happens for those of us who are sort of straddling two different worlds, like, maybe your family's from Mexico, but like for me, my family's from Mexico, but I grew up here. And so
Mhm.
it was always like, well,
Mhm.
I'm too American for my Mexican family, but too
Mhm.
Mexican for Americans. And there's all this,
Yes.
just conflict and
Yes.
confusion of identity that happens. And I'm sure you've experienced some of that as well, given your
Mhm.
story. Though we learn to do something that's called code switching, where like we behave and we act and we speak a certain way in one certain context, and then we behave and
Mhm.
speak and act a different way in a different context. I'm interested to hear, like, how did you navigate that identity and that need to kind of, code switch in your own way throughout your medical career?
Well, interestingly, I think, especially at the beginning when I first moved to the States, it was ignorance. I didn't know what to expect when I moved to this country. So
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know any better. And I just, okay, these are the questions that I'm being asked. And I
Mm-hmm.
just felt like I was educating my peers that didn't realize where Puerto Rico was, or whatever the
Yeah.
case may be. But what is really interesting now, so many years I've been in the States, I have most of my family still in Puerto Rico, many
Uh-huh.
friends, many relatives. So I do go back pretty frequently. But what is a fascinating phenomenon to me is that even though I lived there, grew up there 18 years of my life, and then I moved to the States for college, got married right after. So I never really went back to live in Puerto Rico. I've been gone for a long time, but I am still consider myself 100% Puerto Rican. I speak Spanish every day with either
Yeah.
my mom, my sister, with a relative, with a patient, or with somebody here.
Uh-huh.
But what has been fascinating is going back to Puerto Rico. When I grew up there 18 years of my life, it was never assumed that I wasn't Puerto Rican. And now I
Yeah.
go and people in Puerto Rico are speaking English to me. And I was
Yeah.
like, whoa, wait, what's happening?
Uh-huh.
Did I lose my Puerto Ricanness somehow?
Yeah.
But so then when I'm there, I feel like I have to be extra Puerto Rican
Yeah.
to, like you said, to code switch and really, even though we got married in Puerto Rico, my husband's from St. Louis,
Uh-huh.
and my only bridesmaids that were dark hair, dark skin, dark eyes were his American sisters.
Uh-huh.
Most of my friends look like me.
Yeah.
So it's not like I'm this unicorn in the island.
No.
There's a million people that look like me. And one of my
Uh-huh.
favorite t-shirts of, I think it's the Latino Physician Day. They
Yeah.
were selling all these t-shirts, and one of my favorite ones that I own is Latinas come in all shades, because
Yeah.
it's obviously, we know that
Sure.
rationally, but when we encounter them in our day-to-day, like you said, it's so, we make all these assumptions based
Yeah.
on your external appearance. And for me, of course, because I have my husband's last name, and even my first name, Jacqueline, is not super Spanish, even though
Yeah.
in Puerto Rico it's pronounced Jacqueline. And when I
Yeah.
moved to the US, people would ask me, "What's your name?" And I would say Jacqueline. They're like, "What? Jacqueline? What? Jacqueline?
Uh-huh.
Like Jacqueline Kennedy? Oh,
Yeah.
Jacqueline." when I realized, like,
Oh,
oh,
yeah.
that's how you say it here, because I had
Yeah.
never heard it in English. So
Uh-huh.
yeah, it's an
Yeah. Mhm.
interesting transition. And these questions maybe really go back to thinking about, coming to this country for the first time and not
Mhm.
really knowing what to expect.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
nowadays, of course, the world is so much smaller because of the
Mhm.
internet, and we are exposed to people of other cultures, religions, beliefs, physical
Mhm.
appearances, you name it,
Yeah.
on a daily basis on our phone.
Uh-huh.
So it's a very different experience now. But
Yeah. Well, speaking of experiences, moving
Mhm,
on to the next stage of your journey into medicine, namely medical school and residency. What was your medical education and training like? It has a reputation for being very rigorous, of course, very
mhm,
difficult. You really have to have a lot of self motivation to get through
mhm.
those phases of training. What do you remember? What was memorable?
Oh, so many things.
Uh-huh.
Academically, medical school for me was a joy. My undergrad experience at WashU in St. Louis was very rigorous, even though I
Mhm.
was an outstanding high school student, never really had any troubles. But coming to the States and going to WashU was a very, rigorous undergrad program.
Mhm.
And that was quite shocking to me when
Yeah.
I remember I got my first C in some biochemistry class or something, and I
Uh-huh.
was thought I was going to die. I was never expecting that to be a possibility in my life. So by the
Uh-huh.
time I got to medical school, undergrad really taught me how to study.
Yeah.
And I find, even though medical school is so rigorous, at least in my school, I went to University of Illinois Chicago,
Mhm.
and I had done research in adult cardiology actually for 2 years before
Mhm.
then. And if you can believe this, in those days, if you were doing research full time as an undergrad and you stayed on as a part time researcher while in medical school, you got a tuition waiver.
Oh,
So I
wow.
didn't even apply to other schools. I mean, there was
Uh-huh.
no competing with free medical school in those days. So I ended up, going there, and it was a great experience. Yes, it was definitely rigorous, but I found it to be a much more supportive environment. And this,
Mhm.
again, my personal experience comparing undergrad to medical school.
Yeah.
And, the pass fail honor system, I don't know. I have so many more friends from medical school than from undergrad, because undergrad
Uh-huh.
for me was uber competitive
Mhm.
and cutthroat. And then medical
Yeah.
school just seemed like, we're all in this together. And yes,
Yeah.
we're going to be competing for our respective residencies, but
Mhm.
it did not feel that bad. And then I ended up staying for residency in Chicago.
Yeah. And going through medical school, did you explore other specialties even for a little while, or did you just always know you wanted to do something in pediatrics because of your family member who was a pediatric surgeon? And did you just stick with that? Or what was that process of choosing your specialty like for you?
Well, interestingly, because I had done work in adult cardiology research full time for 2 years, and I was in a very, very small field of cardiology called contrast echocardiography, which at the
Uh-huh.
time was brand new. And our head of our lab, the cardiologist that I worked for, was the world authority. So it was
Mhm.
really fascinating to work with him for 2 years full time, and then all 4 years of medical school. So I was with him for 6 years, and I
Mhm.
traveled the world. I presented all these conferences, and in his mind, he assumed that I was gonna go into internal medicine. He had my life planned out, internal medicine, and then come
Uh-huh.
back to Chicago and do my fellowship in cardiology and stay in the lab.
Mhm.
And, in the moment, I'm like, okay, I will definitely consider this, because I knew that the potential for my professional growth was going to be substantially easier if I
Mhm.
was already being mentored by this man. And
Yeah.
I had already been in that world for 6 years. And then, of course, 2 days into my pediatrics rotation, I was like, no, it has to be peds. There's
Uh-huh.
just something about it that I loved. And it was as much taking care of the kids as it was taking care of the parents. As much as it is
Mhm.
probably the hardest part of pediatrics is relating to the parents, but I felt like my level of empathy was very, very good for pediatrics,
Uh-huh.
if that makes sense. And
Yeah, that does
so
make sense.
I went back to my boss and I said, okay, I think I need to do pediatrics. And he said, okay, I'll support anything you want, but please don't make your final decision until you do internal medicine. And then in very traditional fashion, people that love kids are terrified of adults and vice versa. I did, 3 hours of internal medicine and I was like, no, I need to
Yeah.
take care of kids. So, and in the end, he
Uh-huh.
was great. He was a great mentor and very supportive and everything worked out. So
Yeah, good.
yeah.
Excellent. Yeah, it's interesting. I think a lot of people have that experience where they just do that rotation and there's just this like deep inner knowing. It's like, this is my
Mhm.
tribe. This is where I belong.
Yes,
This is for me.
exactly.
And sometimes some people have that feeling for a few different things and it's hard to decide, but I'm glad you
Yeah.
had so much clarity on your choice. So speaking of pediatrics, you ended up becoming a
Mhm.
pediatric hospitalist. What was
Mhm.
your day-to-day life as a pediatric hospitalist like?
So, interestingly, back in those days, I graduated in 1998. The hospitalist world for pediatrics was fairly new and
Mhm.
almost non-existent in the Midwest, which is where I was in Chicago. So, my husband and I knew that we were moving to California after I finished my residency. And I had my daughter literally the last month of my residency. So we were moving to
Uh-huh.
California with a newborn, but I knew that my personality wasn't necessarily for a 9 to 5 office type of career. I
Mhm.
knew that I love procedures. I like the faster pace of the hospital world, but I also wanted to start a family. We got married so young. We had already been married for like 8 years before we even
Mhm.
had our daughter because it was before I started medical school. So we didn't really have family around. So we needed to be ready to have this first child.
Mhm.
And so I did not want to wait another 3 years of fellowship for a NICU or PICU type of hospital fellowship.
Mhm.
So the hospitalist world was for me the perfect in between. And I did not have to, in those days, you did not have to do a fellowship and it wasn't a separate board certification like it is now.
Mhm.
Now you have to do a 1 to 2 year fellowship post your PEDS residency. But in those days, it was just, a transition. You either did outpatient pediatrics or hospital medicine. And in California, it was definitely growing. So I think
Mhm.
I just lucked out. I found the job fairly easy here at the Children's Hospital of Orange County. It was my one and only job I had.
Uh-huh.
It was in the same place for 20 years and
Nice.
I loved it. I loved it. It was great. There's pros to being a hospitalist because you get, for example, you get weekdays off. You a shift worker, so you're going to have some days that are off in the middle of the week, and when you have a family and things like that, even if you don't, it just going to the post office and being able to do
Uh-huh.
those things that are not as easy
Oh
to
yeah.
do if you're working 9 to 6 Monday to Friday. So I really like that aspect of it, but of course, then there's the you live in the hospital, so you are working weekends, you're working nights, you're working holidays. And at the very beginning, when we weren't fully staffed, it was definitely a little intense.
Yeah.
Although I did like the fact that when you're in the hospital, you're on, right? In my program, we didn't really have on-call situation.
Mhm.
When you're working, you're there, and when you're not, you're not.
Mhm.
We don't cover a panel of patients. We don't take calls at nighttime, that kind of thing.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
that's definitely very different than the outpatient world. And again, we took turns covering the holidays and the weekends and things like
Mhm.
that.
Yeah.
So we
Fantastic.
have, for my particular program, we had 8-hour day shifts, 16-hour night shifts that were 4 p.m. to 8 a.m., and then 24
Mhm.
hour weekend shifts.
Uh-huh. Gotcha. Yeah. What kind of things? So for a lot of our listeners, maybe they're in
Mhm.
college, they don't completely understand like all the different specialties yet. What kind of
Mhm.
conditions does a pediatric hospitalist see? What was your bread and butter of pediatric hospital medicine?
Interestingly, my bread and butter was always conditions that probably will not be seen anymore because
Uh-huh.
thankfully we have vaccines for them. So in the past, a child's pediatrician that saw the child in the office when the child was sick enough to be hospitalized, that same doctor went to the hospital to see that patient
Mhm.
and manage them, discharge them, admit them, do all of the hospital care. It was done by their office pediatrician.
Uh-huh.
And over the years, it started with adults and internal medicine. It was more practical, more cost effective, more efficient,
Mhm.
and better patient outcomes if the care was separated. So then the outpatient pediatricians are seeing patients in the office, and we collaborate with them when their patients are sick enough to be in the hospital,
Uh-huh.
either surgical or medical problems. So in pediatrics, of course, the winter, we're seeing a lot of respiratory illnesses,
Mhm.
especially RSV, which now has been in the news because we are, now starting to roll out a new vaccine, which will
Uh-huh.
hopefully eliminate the need to admit especially the younger babies that got
Yeah.
RSV that got very, very sick.
Mhm.
And then in my day there was rotavirus, which also there's an infant vaccine now, but we
Uh-huh.
saw, and that's a gastrointestinal vomiting diarrhea illness. But again, the younger infants would get dehydrated pretty quickly and needed to be in the hospital. So those
Uh-huh.
were respiratory and GI were kind of our bread and butter. And then in
Yeah.
my hospital, we have a policy of following all the surgical patients along with the surgeon. So there's a lot of
Mhm.
collaboration, which I really do like. We collaborate very closely with our outpatient
Uh-huh.
pediatricians and also, with the rest of the hospital team. So,
Yeah.
and actually, if I can add, another benefit of the hospitalist world for me was that there were so many opportunities for leadership roles within the hospital. And granted, outpatient pediatricians always welcome to be leaders in the hospital, but when you live in the hospital, it's such a valuable experience because I was in every committee the hospital had. I chaired many committees. I was chief of staff. It just allowed me to develop those skills that I am most certainly using now in my non-clinical career. But at the same time, it makes it so real for you because this is your world. This is where you're working. So
Yeah.
the performance review committee or the peer committee where we're reviewing cases from other pediatricians becomes very important. And all the processes, the quality improvement, all of the committees, pharmacy, therapeutics, all of that, it makes so much more sense for hospital doctors to be involved in those leadership roles. And I really did enjoy that part of it.
Excellent. All right. Well, fantastic. Sounds like you had a really wonderful, successful career as a pediatric hospitalist at a major
Mhm.
children's hospital in California. That's so
Mhm.
amazing. Now, before we run out of time, I do want to talk to you about your nonprofit organization called
Mhm.
Scrub Sisters. So tell me
Mhm.
about it. Where did this idea come from? When did you start? And what are you hoping to do through this organization?
Well, thank you for asking. Yes, this has been my passion and full-time project for this last year. And honestly, a lot of the questions that you asked about challenges throughout medical training, I feel like founders, just like entrepreneurs, when they start something, it's because they either want to solve a problem or create something they wish they would have had themselves.
Hmm.
And in
Yeah.
my case, especially when I was starting medical school and married for 1 year, back in those days when that was very unusual, I wish I would have had other women that I could have talked to about
Hmm.
navigating married life and medicine, especially with a husband that's not in medicine.
Yeah.
He's in business. So
Hmm.
and I can think of several times along my career where I wish I would have had a sister. And even though in pediatrics, there were certainly, especially nowadays, I have a lot more colleagues that are female. When
Uh-huh.
I started, it was literally me and men that were 10 years older than me. So I felt out of sorts and trying to navigate this by myself. I also always have loved teaching and mentoring, but I did my clinical shifts at our community hospital. So I didn't really get the experience. And I did miss that interacting with medical students and residents and fellows on a daily basis. I would go up to give lectures, but it's not the same interaction. I always really enjoyed that when I was a resident. So there were several instances in the last year where it just seemed to make sense. I gave a talk about my journey from clinical to non-clinical, and there were two students there, one pre-med, one med student, that asked me if I would mentor them. And of course I said yes. And now I'm at the age where a lot of my friends have children that are in the pre-med med track. I have nieces and nephews. So I've been mentoring kind of one-off for years. But after that one particular meeting, when these two other young women that I didn't know, they weren't the children of any of my friends or relatives or anyone, asked for mentorship, I immediately said yes. And then when I turned off the computer, I said, wait, why am I doing this individually? And why are they only benefiting from my singular experience? So that's when I decided, I'm like, I think we should do this as a community and have women of all different backgrounds, specialties, geographies come together, and not just that mentor-mentee relationship, but also that peer-to-peer support, right? So it's not necessarily that the mid to late careers are, helping out the younger generation. It really is about having conversations of the entire spectrum of life in medicine. And that's why our pillars are community and mentorship, which are pretty self-explanatory, real life conversation, because I want to be able to talk about, in my case, how do I deal with being married and starting medical school? But as you move on, for most women, there's going to be either, family, raising a young family, then older family. And then there's, always conversations to be had later on in life about retirement, about transitioning your career, about divorce, about taking care of elderly parents. There's so much of life that happens parallel to our professional training and careers. And so I want that real life conversation to be happening. There's some amazing women in medicine groups that are having great conversations about equity in medicine, about, supporting and propelling women in academic medicine and things like that I think are super important. But I also want to be able to talk about planning a wedding while you're a medical student, or pumping breast milk when you're doing an ER shift. And I think those conversations are really important. And then diversity, of course, very important to me, especially ethnic diversity. And yes, 2% is not enough. And we will certainly work on that. And then advocacy is our fifth pillar. And advocacy, we are planning on starting with fertility, pregnancy, and maternity leave rights for trainees. And that has come from a lot of different inspirations from a lot of different women in the group. But my goal is to establish local chapters. So I want this to be an in-person group, not an anonymous Facebook group with 60,000 members, which I am part of them. They definitely have their benefit, but especially the diversity and advocacy work is so much better served by doing it locally, right? The diversity conversation in Kansas is not going to be the same as it is in California. And same with the advocacy work. So many of the laws surrounding trainees, which I've learned a lot lately, especially surrounding about trainee fertility and rights for pregnancy and maternity leave, are very state dependent. So the conversations also need to start at a local level, which I love. And that way you can have that in-person network with your own community. And hopefully that's what will happen. We just launched a few months ago. So we're getting, and I'm considering this a soft launch because I have a lot going on in my personal life right now, but I have chapters opening. My first chapter is going to launch in Puerto Rico, which makes me so happy. And second, it will actually be in Utah. And then we'll have a chapter in Southern California, one in Washington, D.C., and one in Delhi, India by
That's
the end
fantastic.
of the fall. So
Amazing.
Yes.
Congratulations. Look at what you're building.
Yeah.
Now, for students who, pre-meds, who might be interested in joining, or even
Mhm.
medical students who, or residents who might be listening, as well as physicians, how do they join
Mhm.
this network, this community of Scrub Sisters?
Great question. And the easiest way to join is through our website. The membership is free. And I went against a lot of advice from a lot of business
Uh-huh.
people, including my husband. But
Yeah.
this is a nonprofit for a reason. My ultimate goal, actually, with monetizing the platform, is to offer scholarships for women
Mm-hmm.
applying to medical school and applying to residency. The cost of medical
Uh-huh.
school applications, as I'm sure you're well aware,
Yes.
it's estimated between $5,000 and $10,000. So it's the
Yeah.
first roadblock to access to a medical career.
Yeah.
And for example, one of my Puerto Rico founders was telling me she had to take 2 years off so she could work full time so she could pay to apply for medical school,
Uh-huh.
because she said getting loans to pay for medical school is much easier than getting loans to apply for medical school.
Absolutely.
So that's kind of my financial model. But no, I would never charge a membership fee, especially to
Uh-huh.
a student. So the membership is free. There's no time commitment. Scrubsisters.org is our
Mm-hmm.
website.
Uh-huh.
And all the information is there. And then if anybody's interested, and I have even high schoolers that are starting chapters,
Yeah.
local chapters, and then they can just reach out directly to me or through the website. And my email is Dr. Jack, DRJACQ at
Mm-hmm.
scrubsisters.org.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you so much. It sounds like a
Yes.
fantastic community that you're building. And I've already
Thank
joined. I
you.
can't wait to see
Thank
the
you.
Utah chapter
Yes.
being built out. So,
Yes.
one last question for you before we wrap
Mhm.
up. If you could give one piece of advice to students who are currently in the pre-medical world and looking forward to becoming physicians, looking forward to medical school, what advice would you give them?
Well, first, I would tell them it is so worth it. It is still, to me, the best career. And of course, I'm biased with pediatrics, but I think medicine is still well worth it. So the struggles, rejection is redirection. Don't let that discourage you. And to me, there is no singular path to getting there. There's so many ways. I am a strong proponent of taking time off at some point between undergrad and medical school, just regroup, get clinical experience, whatever it is you need, either to maximize your application or to honestly take a mental break. Because I feel
Mm-hmm.
for people my generation, the stress, the grind, the pressure of the career started really in college, but
Mm-hmm.
nowadays it starts in high school. And
Yeah.
so eventually 4 years of high school, 4 years of college, 4 years of medical school, your mental health is priceless and irreplaceable. So I'm a big proponent of taking some time off at some point. And for me, of course, I took my 2 years off, did research full time, loved it.
Uh-huh.
I had a regular schedule, I had a paycheck, I
Uh-huh.
got married, and it was great. So
Uh-huh.
I can't stress that enough. And
Yeah.
and the other thing too is I think we talk a lot about work-life balance
Mm-hmm.
and how the goal is to have this work-life balance. And I feel for me personally, I cannot complain. I had
Yeah.
work-life balance because I always worked part-time. And to
Mm-hmm.
me, that was my balance. But
Yeah.
I think going into medicine thinking that you're going to have that work-life balance throughout, work-life balance is a myth. I don't think
Yeah.
it exists at all times, right?
Mm-hmm.
We
Yeah.
strive for it, but it's okay that you're not balanced all the time,
Mm-hmm.
because there are some times when you just have to put your head down and get through the thing, get
Mm-hmm.
through to the next stage, and then things become easier and then they'll become harder again. It's like parenting. It's like having a baby. You have to just close your eyes and get through
Yeah.
those first, few weeks.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, the medical training and career are the same. There's going to be times where you're going to feel like you're out of balance. Don't let that discourage you. That does not mean that medicine is a career with no balance. It just means
Uh-huh.
that at that particular stage, it might not feel like it is. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does. Definitely. Well, thank you so much. Thanks for sharing your story today and for sharing about your organization, Scrub Sisters. Please check out the website,
Yeah.
scrubsisters.org, if you're interested in getting a new community of support. And thank you for sharing all about pediatric hospital medicine for those budding pediatricians out there who are going to be the next generation of pediatricians. Thanks so much, Dr. Jack.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Of course. And to our listeners, thanks for tuning in. And until next time.